In March of 1883, Thomas Henriksen thought he was fixing a simple problem in his barn. A rotten floorboard in the northwest corner had started to sag, and he did not want a horse or cow to step through it by mistake. He pried at the board with a crowbar, leaned his weight forward, and in the next moment, the wood gave way completely. His boot dropped through into empty space, not stopping until his leg plunged down nearly to the knee. Thomas caught himself just in time, heart pounding, hanging over a hole that should not have existed. At first he thought he had broken into a gopher tunnel or a collapsed root cellar, but when he pulled back more boards and lowered a lantern into the darkness, his breath caught in his throat. The light revealed not a hole, but a room, a real room, dug carefully into the earth beneath the barn. Thomas lay flat on the barn floor, holding the lantern steady, trying to understand what he was seeing. The chamber below was about 10 feet long and 8 feet wide, with walls lined neatly in sod bricks. They were stacked tight and straight, packed with clay like the better sod houses on the prairie. 4 thick cottonwood beams supported the ceiling, and in the far corner sat something that made no sense at all. A small iron stove. A stove underground beneath a barn. Thomas widened the opening and climbed down carefully. His boots hit hard dirt that felt solid and dry. The air smelled faintly of earth and old smoke, but there was no rot, no dampness. This place had been used, and used well. He examined the stove next. It was small, but well made, with a proper door and working damper. A stovepipe ran upward through the ceiling, hidden so cleverly it passed for an ordinary barn vent outside. Someone had built this place with care. Someone had heated it. Someone had hidden it. Thomas stood there in silence, lantern light flickering against the sod walls, feeling like he had stepped into another man's thoughts. This was not an accident. This was a secret. He sat on a hay bale afterward, staring at the barn wall, thinking about the land he now owned. Thomas was 29 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to Kansas 5 years earlier with his wife Ingrid and their baby son. They had worked other people's farms, saved every cent, worn out clothes until they were rags. Last November they had finally bought this homestead. 160 acres, a small house, a good barn. The price had been low because the owner was desperate. The seller had been Mrs. Adelaide Cooper, a 72-year-old widow who wanted nothing more than to leave Kansas and live with her daughter back east. She had spoken bitterly of the land, the cold, and the loneliness. She had never once mentioned a hidden room under the barn. Thomas was sure she had not known it existed, which meant her husband had built it. Albert Cooper. Thomas asked around town quietly over the next few days. He did not mention the dugout, only the man. What he learned made the room feel even stranger. Cooper had built the barn himself 10 years earlier, refusing help. He had been known as difficult, suspicious, and unfriendly. During the terrible winter of 1873, when the cold nearly killed people across the county, Cooper had claimed his barn stayed warm enough to work in. Neighbors remembered smoke rising from the barn vent when no fire should have been there. They had laughed at him then. They had called him strange. Now Thomas knew the truth. Cooper had survived that winter in comfort, underground, while everyone else suffered. And he had told no one, not even his wife. For 3 days, Thomas examined the dugout closely. The structure was sound. The walls were solid. The stove worked. Most important of all, the earth itself provided insulation. 12 inches of packed sod on all sides. Heat would stay trapped here instead of escaping into the wind. And Thomas had a problem that this room could solve. He could not afford winter fuel. Buying the homestead had emptied their savings and left them in debt. Heating the house through winter would require cords of firewood he did not have time or money to gather. Every winter broke men like him. It forced them to sell land, lose animals, or freeze slowly while pretending everything was fine. This room changed everything. When Thomas told Ingrid, she listened carefully, arms crossed, doubt in her eyes. Living underground sounded foolish, dangerous. But Thomas explained the insulation, the stove, the fuel savings. He told her his plan. They would keep it secret. If it worked, They would survive winter. If it failed, no one would know they had tried. Ingrid did not like the secrecy, but she trusted her husband more than the opinions of neighbors who would mock them. So Thomas worked. All through April and May he crawled underground, reinforcing beams, thickening walls, improving ventilation. He hauled earth out bucket by bucket. His hands split and his back ached. But slowly the dugout became stronger, warmer, better. He built a trapdoor that sat flush with the barn floor and disappeared under scattered hay. By summer, the secret was ready. Neighbors noticed his small woodpile later that year. They warned him. They laughed. They shook their heads. One man told him plainly that his family would freeze before February. Thomas only smiled and said he would manage. When the first hard freeze came in November, the truth revealed itself. The house stayed cold. The barn hid warmth. Thomas lit the stove underground and felt heat rise gently around him. Not burning heat, steady heat, the kind that soaked into bones. In 20 minutes, the room felt like a different world. He worked in his shirt sleeves while the land above froze solid. That night, he told Ingrid the numbers. The dugout held warmth on a fraction of the fuel. What would heat the house for a day could heat the dugout for nearly a week. Winter deepened. The cold grew cruel. Neighbors burned through their wood fast. Animals suffered. Faces hardened. And beneath Thomas Henrikson's barn, a quiet, warm room waited, unseen, holding back the winter. The real test had not yet come. And when it did, everything would change. By December, the Kansas prairie felt like it had turned against the people living on it. The wind never stopped. It slipped through cracks in walls, under doors, and into bones. Each morning, Thomas woke before dawn to frost on the windows and ice in the wash basin. He built only a small fire in the house stove, just enough to keep the worst of the cold away. Then he pulled on his coat and crossed the yard to the barn. Beneath the hay and the quiet boards of the barn floor, the dugout waited. Thomas opened the hidden door, climbed down, and lit the small stove. The change was always the same and always amazed him. Cold air gave way to steady warmth. The earth held the heat close, refusing to give it back to the wind. Within minutes, the underground room felt alive and safe. Soon the dugout became the center of their days. Thomas moved his tools down there. He repaired harnesses, sharpened blades, and fixed broken equipment while the stove whispered softly. Ingrid brought her sewing and mending. Their son Niels played on the dirt floor with bits of string and wood, happy and warm, unaware that other children nearby cried from cold fingers and aching feet. They lived quietly and carefully. At night, they still slept in the house, bundled in quilts with a small fire burning low. It was not comfortable, but it was enough. During the day, the dugout saved them. Neighbors began to notice. Eric Thorson stopped by one afternoon in mid-December. He stood in the house, rubbing his hands together, eyeing the small fire. He looked at Thomas's face, at Ingrid's hands, at Niels playing calmly instead of shivering. "You look better than you should," Eric said. "I'm burning wood like it's falling from the sky, and my house is still cold. You don't have half the pile I do." Thomas shrugged and smiled. "We layer our clothes and don't complain." Eric frowned. He did not believe that, but he let it go. Pride kept him from pushing further. As the weeks passed, the cold deepened. Wood piles shrank across the county. Men cut down fence posts and old sheds to keep fires alive. Faces grew sharp with hunger and worry. But Thomas's hidden wood supply in the barn loft stayed nearly untouched. Then came Christmas week. On December 23rd, the temperature fell hard and fast. By nightfall, it was 20 below zero. The next morning, it was worse. Wind cut across the land like a knife. Livestock froze in their stalls. Water turned to ice in minutes. On Christmas morning, the thermometer in town read 28 below zero. The cold was deadly. Families huddled around roaring stoves, feeding them every scrap they could find. Eric Thorson burned through 2 weeks of firewood in 3 days. Others fared worse. One family lost their milk cows despite dragging them into the house. The prairie showed no mercy. Thomas made his decision before the worst of it hit. He moved his family fully into the dugout. They carried down blankets, food, and water. The small stove burned steadily, never pushed too hard. The dugout stayed between 45 and 52 degrees. Not warm like summer, but warm enough to live, warm enough to sleep, warm enough to survive. Niels thought it was an adventure. Ingrid managed the tight space with calm focus. Thomas checked the stovepipe often, making sure the vent stayed clear. Above them, the barn stood silent and ordinary, hiding their refuge. On Christmas night, while the wind screamed outside, they ate beans and bread underground. Thomas looked around the small room and thought about Albert Cooper, the man who had built this place and never shared it, the man who had survived while others suffered. Thomas made a promise to himself then. If they lived through this winter, he would not keep the secret. The cold broke on December 27th. It rose to 5 below zero, which felt almost gentle after what had come before. Thomas built up the house fire again, preparing to move life back above ground. That afternoon, Eric Thorson appeared at the door. He looked broken. His face was burned raw by the wind. His hands were wrapped in cloth. His eyes carried exhaustion and anger. "I want the truth," Eric said. "You came through this better than anyone I know. My family nearly froze." "What are you hiding?" Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come to the barn." He led Eric across the snow, into the barn to the northwest corner. He kicked aside the hay, opened the trapdoor, and warm light spilled upward. Eric stared down into the earth, speechless. Thomas climbed down and waited. After a long moment, Eric followed. The warmth hit him immediately. He looked at the sod walls, the stove, the shelves. His mouth fell open. "You live down here," Eric said softly. "We survived down here," Thomas replied. "Albert Cooper built it years ago. I found it by accident. It saved my family." Eric sat down hard on a chair. "You could have told us." "I needed to be sure," Thomas said. "I needed proof." Eric nodded slowly. "Can my family stay here for a few days? We have nothing left to burn." "Of course," Thomas said without hesitation. That night, 10 people filled the dugout. It was crowded but warm. Eric asked questions. Thomas answered all of them. By the next week, the secret was spreading. People came to see it. Some doubted. Some believed immediately. Thomas showed everyone the truth, explained the risks and the rewards. Plans were made. Shovels were lifted. Knowledge moved from one man to many. The winter was not over yet, but the secret was no longer buried. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. By January of 1884, the dugout beneath Thomas Henrikson's barn was no longer a secret whispered between desperate men. Word moved fast across the frozen prairie. Neighbors came in pairs, then in groups, stamping snow from their boots, ducking into the barn, and standing silent as warm air rose from the hidden opening in the floor. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others dropped to their knees to study the sod walls and stovepipe with careful eyes. Wives asked practical questions. Men asked how deep to dig, how wide to build, how to vent smoke without killing the people inside. Thomas answered every question honestly. He spoke of the strength of the beams, the importance of ventilation, and the danger of rushing the work. Not every man believed. A few laughed and said they would never live like moles under the ground. But most listened closely. The winter had taught them respect. When the ground finally softened in spring, shovels came out across the county. 5 families began digging their own underground rooms. Some built beneath barns. Others dug near their houses. Designs changed as people learned. Mistakes were made. One man hit water and gave up. Another nearly poisoned himself before fixing his stovepipe. But most succeeded. The next winter told the truth. Families with dugouts burned far less wood. Children stayed warm. Livestock survived. Money once lost to fuel stayed in pockets and turned into seed, cows, and tools. The difference between scraping by and moving forward came down to a few feet of earth and shared knowledge. Thomas never charged for help. He never took credit. When people thanked him, he pointed to the barn floor and said the answer had been there long before him. He only chose to share it. Years passed. Thomas and Ingrid raised 4 children on that land. In time, they built a larger house, strong and well-insulated. Even then, Thomas kept the dugout. He worked there through many winters, warm and quiet beneath the storms. Albert Cooper's name faded into history. Few remembered the man who built the room and hid it from the world. But Thomas Henriksen was remembered. Not for finding the dugout, but for opening it. When Thomas left the farm decades later, the barn still stood. Beneath it, the dugout waited. Other families used it. Every one of them passed on the knowledge. The barn was torn down many years later, and the room was finally filled in. But by then, the idea had already spread. What saved them was not just sod and iron and earth. It was a choice. One man kept knowledge buried. Another shared it. And that choice made all the difference.